When the 34-year-old Henry Kendall arrived in Gosford late in 1873, his life was in ruins. 4 years earlier, he'd given up his job in the state government offices in Sydney, moved to Melbourne and tried to live by his writing, which he couldn't any more than you could do then and you can do now, in my experience. But his earnings weren't enough to support himself, his wife and his child. He sank into poverty and plunged into alcoholism. His one-year-old daughter died in February 1870. In October, he and his wife returned to Sydney, and his son Frederick was born, and then he and his wife separated. He was then arrested for forging a cheque for £1, and he escaped jail only by being found insane. He was released, but 6 months later he was committed to Gladesville Asylum, and the admission sheet records his habits are intemperate and he frequently takes opium and sedatives in large quantities. He's said to have been violent and to have threatened suicide during the present attack. And he was there for 3 weeks in July 1871, and 2 years later in 1873 he was committed again, this time staying for 2 months. Upon his release, friends arranged a newspaper job for him in Grafton, where he'd worked 10 years earlier. And he set sail, and the story is he disembarked in Newcastle for a drink, spent all his funds, the boat left, so he proceeded to walk back to Sydney, which is quite a way. I wonder if he didn't actually get off in Gosford, if the steamer didn't stop there, but I've been unable to find any shipping records to prove one way or the other. So if anybody knows any shipping records, it's something to follow up. Anyway, in October or November 1873, he met Charles Fagan in Campbell's Hotel in Gosford. Is that still standing, Campbell's? Anybody know? I might go and have a look afterwards. Yeah. Charles was 41. He was the eldest of 7 sons of Peter Fagan. And he and his brothers, William and Joseph, took pity on Kendall. They took him into the Fagan household, the house here, and nursed him back to recovery. In a little booklet, The Fagans, the Cottage and Kendall, Joan Fenton noted, in the little room which the poet Henry Kendall occupied may be seen the colonial sofa on which he slept and on which he carved his initials. If he did carve them, I suppose they're authentic, I don't know. But there's some authentic manuscripts here. Joseph recalled that Kendall used to write down there in the glen, always in the early morning and after sunset. At other times he gave us a hand on the farm, and well, he was just like one of us boys in the family. Peter Fagan had been transported from Ireland in 1820, aged 27, and after the expiration of his sentence, he took up land here in Brisbane Water and eventually developed the family timber business. It seems that Peter probably knew of Henry as a writer already, which might explain why the family took him in. His son Joseph recalled, chance had introduced them. Kendall was writing in Melbourne, not having too good a time. My father had spoken to me of him. Later we got him up here to live with us. My father used to do a bit of writing too. Well, Peter's unlikely to have seen the Melbourne papers. I don't think they got up here. But he could have known of Kendall from the Sydney magazine, the Freeman's Journal, which was a Roman Catholic monthly modelled on the Irish magazine of the same name. And it had a strongly Irish flavour. And Kendall's mother was of Irish descent. Peter Fagan was, of course, Irish. And Kendall began writing in Freeman's Journal in 1871 with a whole 11-part series on Irish poets. And he carried on writing in Freeman's up until the middle of 1872, when he seemed to have had another collapse. In Melbourne, Kendall had been a friend of the poet Adam Lindsay Gordon, who shot himself in 1870, unable to pay the printer for his last book of poems. Kendall's first biographer claimed that Kendall himself had no pleasure in horses and loathed what he considered the idiotic frenzy of the racecourse. He and Lindsay Gordon could never grow intimate by reason of any community of tastes. But the Fagans were as heavily into horses as the champion steeplechase rider Gordon. As the plaque on the wall outside on the cottage there records, the Fagans were keen racing men and bred champion horses. So it would be nice to say that the Fagans changed Kendall's attitude to horses, but it's unlikely Kendall could have spent much time with Adam Lindsay Gordon if he'd hated horses as much as that. And a year before he arrived in Gosford, Kendall wrote an enthusiastic account of a horse race in Marcus Clarke's novel Long Odds. So I don't think he was anti-horses, but undoubtedly when he arrived here, he was restored to physical health while with the Fagans, and undoubtedly he spent a fair bit of time on horseback now, which of course he couldn't have afforded in Melbourne. Charles Fagan recalled, book in hand, Kendall wandered for hours here and in the gullies. He was an unskillful rider, too often absorbed in reveries, and he preferred walking. My brother had the mail contract, and sometimes for the sake of a change, Kendall used to jump on a horse and ride to Kincumber, about 9 miles away. The road is very pretty to Greenpoint and thence across country to Broadwater Lagoon. Joseph, the brother Joseph, who had the mail run, which was a 2-day trip into Sydney and back, recalled that Kendall sometimes would come along part of the way, always up the mountain to his favourite spot at the head of the glen, and there he'd often spend the whole day by the waterfalls, or in the darkened fern-grown recesses, coming back to the farm when night fell, while I went on my way. Joseph was more positive than his brother Charles about Kendall's horsemanship. He claimed Kendall could ride a horse well and would be up with the best of us when yarding a fractious mod of cattle, and was a good judge of a horse and knew the pedigree of every horse racing at Randwick. And in fact, Kendall did later write a couple of racing poems. Well, Kendall had arrived here October or November 73. January the next year his brother died of tuberculosis in Sydney. But as far as the rest of Kendall's family were concerned, his wife, his mother, his sisters, he had disappeared, and he kept his whereabouts totally secret. But he was in touch with some of his old literary friends. The poet Philip Holdsworth was visiting relatives up at Brisbane Water and encountered Kendall, and they began to correspond. But Kendall was determined to distance his old poetical Bohemian past. He wrote to Holdsworth in September 1874, that's a year after he'd been here, "I haven't a scrap left of my Bohemian writings." And the writer and journalist Sheridan Moore, who'd helped Kendall get his first book published, also resumed correspondence. And Kendall wrote to him October 74, "I have taken nothing stronger than tea for the last 12 months. He then crossed out 12 and wrote 11. And he continued, "Nothing shall tempt me to write for money again, and the life I have chosen precludes me from writing for pleasure." And May the following year, 1875, he wrote to Moore, "I write to you chiefly to beg that you will not divulge my whereabouts to any one of my relatives. I don't want to have anything to do with either the Rutter, his wife's family, either the Rutter or the Kendall mob. I am as tired of one family as I am of the other. I have to thank you for your kind effort to obtain literary work for me, and to say that such kindness is only natural to you, but I do not need employment of that kind. I can do without it. Literature has so long been my crutch that I don't think I shall ever use it as a walking stick. If my relatives leave me alone, things will run smoothly enough. When I saw you last, I had for the first time during the last 19 months taken a glass till too much. Since then I've not touched anything stronger than water," which is a constant refrain of his. But he repeated the rejection of literature frequently in his letters at this time. He wrote to Moore, "The fact is I hate the sight of a pen. I may from time to time scribble off a squib or a prose trifle, but as to more serious work, I had quite enough of it during the weary years between 1869 and 74. Give me the bovine life and let the gods go hang." And he wrote to Thomas Butler, the editor of Freeman's Journal, "I'd rather turn bullock driver than go back to the ragged old Bohemian life." But it was with his literary friends he kept corresponding. Now these claims he'd given up the literary life don't seem to be true. Once he'd settled down in West Gosford, he seems to have begun writing again. Michael Ackland, his latest biographer, suggests Kendall was writing anonymous prose paragraphs to a feature called Sydney Town Talk in the Town and Country Journal through 1873 and 1874. And then the first poem to appear in the Town and Country Journal of Kendall's was the Song of the Shingle Splitters in May 1874, 6 months after he arrived here. And it's probably the first poem he wrote in the Gosford district. It's the Song of the Shingle Splitters. I noticed the roof is roofed with shingles. In the dark wild woods where the lone owl broods and the dingoes nightly yell, where the curlew's cry goes floating by, we splitters of shingles dwell. And significantly it shows Kendall drawing on the material of his immediate environment, of his current life in the Fagans timber business. They're exporting timber across to America as well as all around Australia. And it's a mark of his newfound respect for the world of hard manual labour, which is very different from the world he inhabited in Melbourne, where he joined the Yorick Club, which was full of sort of posh, upper-class young Englishmen who'd come out, like Marcus Clark, Adam Lizzie Gordon. I mean, they were all good drinkers, they were all good mates of the Kendalls, but they were a bit posh. And later, Kendall went on to write other tributes to manual workers like Bill the Bullock Driver and Jim the Splitter. July 1874, he'd been here about 9 months then, he published The Voice in the Wild Oak. And beneath the title he writes, Written in the Shadow of 1872. Those were the years of homelessness and alcoholism before he came to Gosford. It begins with regrets for 12 wasted years. But I, who am that perished soul, have wasted these powers of mine, that I can never write that whole, pure, perfect speech of thine, tree. And then the song of the wild oak, when high Hunder smites the hill and hunts the wild dog to his den, is a song that Kendall celebrates, and it's a gloomy song. Thy cries like maledictions shrill and shriek from glen to glen, as if a frightful memory whipped thy soul for some infernal crime. And the admission report for Kendall, when he went into Daysville Hospital, noted he imagines he was accused of murdering a child. And the death of his daughter in Melbourne haunted him with these feelings of guilt and responsibility. This sadness and guilt were, which is a lot of his poems expressed, was very deep-seated. But the physical environment here began to work a healing process. And in the middle of 1875, he wrote an essay called Arcadia at Our Gates for the Town and Country Journal, which celebrates the whole district here, which he stressed most people didn't know about. It was too far for people from Sydney to have discovered, and it wasn't widely settled. And he celebrates the bold promontory of Barrenjoey, the magnificent opening of Pittwater, the gleaming crescent of sand known as Ettalong Beach, the quiet hill-folded waters of Woy Woy, from whose margins the ridges run back in magnificent buttresses towards the lone home of the echoes, Mooney Creek. But it's a picture not without its horror. He doesn't gloss over the massacre of the original inhabitants. He writes, the military displayed great barbarity. In the middle of the night, camp after camp was surprised, and the occupants, men, women and children, shot down. Shot down like native dogs. The poor friendly blacks fared no better than the others, and the whole affair was a horrible satire upon our civilization. December 1875, he published the poem Mooney, and this also carries the superscription Written in the Shadow of 1872, and it opens with a cheerful note recalling Robert Browning's Oh, to be in England now that April's there, but it soon turns to dark menace. It says, to be by Mooney now, where the dark hills of wonder, scarred with storm and cleft asunder by the strong sword of the thunder, make a night on morning's brow. So it's the gloom he responds to, and the shadow of 1872 is there in the regrets he expresses for the past when the life of inspiration, like a god's transfiguration, was the shining change in me. The time before his energy is wasted away. But Mooney offered hope and regeneration. Still to be by Mooney cool, where the water blossoms glister, just a rest beyond the burning outer world. Just a rest beyond the burning outer world, it sneers and spurning. Ah, my heart, my heart is yearning, still to be by Mooney cool. Well, those poems he must have written while he was living here, and they were published in the time he was living here. But the other poems that celebrate this district were not published till after he'd left. Probably they were written later when he went to work for the Fagans branch up in Camden Haven in July 1875. The most famous of them, Names Upon a Stone, which is the name of today's celebration. This appeared in the Town and Country Journal in 1878, inscribed to G.L. Fagan. It was dedicated to George Fagan in the poem. I see the river of my dream 4 wasted years ago. Narara of the waterfalls, the darling of the hills, whose home is under mountain walls by many looted rills, her bright green nooks and channels cool I never more may see. But ah, the past was beautiful, the sights that used to be. And the poem recalls an episode, Christmas Day 1874, when the Fagan brothers had walked with Kendall up the valley and sat by the rock pool in the glen. And before leaving, they chipped their initials on the stone. And Peter here tells me that he's actually discovered the initials, and they're still there and still can be seen. So, but apparently it's hard to get to, so I'm not going to be struggling up there today. But I'm waiting to receive a photograph. Joseph Fagan recalled the episode in 1931 when they unveiled the stone pillar on the old Pacific Highway, the Central Coast Highway it's called now, on which a verse of the poem was inscribed. There was a rock pool in a glen beyond Narara's sands. The mountains shut it in from men in flowerful fairy lands. But once we found its dwelling place, the lovely and the lone, and in a dream I stooped to trace our names upon a stone. And it's one of his most successful and most admired poems. The celebration of natural beauty, the waterfall, the rock pool, and the moss evoke a light, delicate scene. But beneath it's the sadder note, the lament for Peter Fagan Sr., who died in 1876. This was what the Shingle Splitters drank water, as Kendall pointed out. Back to names Upon a Stone. A beauty like the light of song is in my dreams that show the grand old man who lived so long, as spotless as the snow. A fitting garland for the dead I cannot compass yet, but many things he did and said I never will forget. Then a month after publishing Names Upon a Stone, Kendall drew on his memories of the Central Coast again for a prose account of a trip called Overland from Gosford to Sydney, which he published under the name of Tiresias, not his own name, in the Town and Country Journal. And this describes a trip from Gosford to Sydney. And he starts off suitably prepared with prime Jamaica rum, once again, and the anonymous narrator, he doesn't actually give his name, so it may not be Kendall. The anonymous narrator sets out, contented, aye, even happy, on his rum. Those rugged Mooney hills lying back there to the south and west of the Gosford waters never echoed more jolly songs than mine were on that eventful night. But then, having drained his flask, he finds that the mere dip in the hills that he's been directed to transformed into what appeared to be a yawning Gehenna, a yawning hell. Into the abyss I went, down, down, 1,000 fathoms down. At last we reached the bottom and went head first into a great creek. At this point he encounters a certain Billy Burton, and they drain the bottle of rum the narrator is supposed to deliver to a chap called Bloffins. This was the point of the whole trip. Bloffins needed this bottle of rum. But they drain it. I went along singing gaily, a very king of the forest, and hence we threaded the long, moony ravine without tumbling into its dumb, deep waters. At last we came to the ford facing the wall of hill known as Dublin Jack's, and he slithers off the horse's back. How the dreary 13 miles between Dublin Jack and Pete's Ferry were got over, it is beyond my power to tell. Towards morning the moon arose on a landscape cloaked in a wet gleaming mist, a deep decided vapour which every now and then I took to be the Hawkesbury. I staggered along the stony peninsula which divides the fine gloom of the deep-seated moony waters from the bright liberal lustre shed out by the parent stream. And then he bumps into Bloffins at last, who quickly led me to his comfortable little home and seated me in front of a two-gallon keg. What more could a reasonable man desire? I stayed a week in that beautifully situated cottage back there by the junction of the Mooney and the Hawkesbury. Years ago I had to give a public lecture at the university which was dedicated to the memory of Henry Kendall. It was the Blakelock lectures. I didn't know anything about Kendall at the time. My old friend Bob Adamson, who shared some characteristics of Kendall's, I decided to write about him. And I began it with some anecdote of Holdsworth trying to bail Fagan out of the water police station where he'd been locked up, and there was no sign of Kendall there, and out of the blue he hears this voice saying, "My name is Rokey Bokey." So he bails out Mr. Rokey Bokey, who's Kendall. So I started off my lecture on Adamson about this. Anyway, miraculously, who now lives at this junction of the Mooney and the Hawkesbury but the poet Robert Adamson, and the spirit of Henry Kendall carries on. Another Central Coast poem, Narara Creek, appeared in Sydney once a week, again in 1878, and it was a creek Kendall had known well. Joseph Fagan recalled, he wouldn't wait for 2 minutes for the boat that was on the opposite side of Narara Creek, Gosford, when he wanted to cross. He would hear a dive in and the boat would soon be over. He was a good swimmer. And here's the poem. Narara, grandson of the haughty hill torrent, too late in my day have I looked at thy current. Too late in my life to discern and inherit the soul of thy beauty, the joy of thy spirit. And the poem once again expresses his regrets at the way his life has turned out. What life the gods gave me, what largesse I tasted, the youth thrown away and the faculties wasted. I might, as thou seest, have stood in high places, instead of in pits where the brand of disgrace is a byword for scoffers. He actually had a fantasy that he wrote to Henry Parkes, said, I've been thinking of standing for Parliament. But Parkes didn't encourage him. These are the high places he might have stood in. But the force and splendour of Narara Creek, the rushing water, the energy and drive, he presents as a huge contrast with his own depleted energies. But the face of thy river, the torrented power that smites at the rock while it fosters the flower, shall gleam in my dreams with the summer look splendid, and the beauty of woodlands and waterfalls blended. And often I'll think of far forested noises, and the emphasis deep of grand sea-going voices, and turn to Narara the eyes of a lover, when the sorrowful days of my singing are over. There was always this undercurrent of sadness in his poetry, and it's particularly apparent in Curran published in the Town and Country Journal in 1879, which is a very bleak, dark poem. The brand of black devil is there, an evil wind mooneth around. There is doom, there is death in the air, a curse groweth up from the ground. And Curran was the name Peter Fagan gave this cottage. The poem evokes that 1865 tragedy when Fagan accidentally poisoned his wife, and his wife's sister and his daughter with strychnine, given a mistake for quinine. A furlong of fetid black fen with gelid green patches of pond lies dumb by the horns of the glen at the gates of the horror beyond. There's no doubt that the time at Gosford enabled Kendall to recover from the urban torments of Melbourne and Sydney. In Henry Kendall's later years, which a memoir his son Frederick wrote, Frederick quotes Henry's tribute to the Fagans. These gentlemen who worked so hard on my behalf, put up with so much for my sake, and endured so patiently my peculiarities, can never be compensated, never be forgotten. And when the poems written here and after his stay at Gosford were published in his last book, Songs from the Mountains, in 1880, he inscribed a copy. I give this book to Peter Fagan, one of the 3 noble brothers who led me out of Gethsemane. And in October 1880, later that year, he wrote a note of introduction for Michael Fagan, the brother, to meet Marcus Clarke, the novelist who's Kendall's sort of friend in Melbourne. They didn't get on that well. He wrote, I want you to know the bearer. He is the man who led me out of Gethsemane and set me in the sunshine. But Clarke was in his own Gethsemane and too ill to see him. Kendall always recalled his 18 months at Gosford positively, happy with the friendship of the Fagans and happy at his own recovery of responsibility in his life. He was particularly proud of his response to a letter from Charles Fagan in 1875 asking him to frame petitions for a road from Gosford to Narara Ferry and for an annual grant for the repairs required on the Gosford to Possum Creek Road. Charles Fagan wanted Kendall to write the official request for funding. And Kendall endorsed this letter from Charles Fagan. This is from Mr. Fagan, the magistrate with whom I lived at Gosford. The Joe and William he mentions are his brothers. They're all noble fellows. It was I who brought about the establishment of a post office here, i.e. at Gosford. I also wrote the petitions which led to the deepening of Brisbane Water and 2 annual grants for roads. Before I left Gosford, the inhabitants presented me with a watch, etc. I only mention these facts to show that I must have been behaving myself properly while I was in the specified district. So Kendall's arrival in Gosford is one of the most significant events of his life. Indeed, it saved his life. He was on a deep downward track before. It restored him to health, it provided him with paid employment, and it inspired him to resume writing poetry, which he continued to do for a further 9 productive years till his death in 1st of August 1882.